together. I get that everybody in this province, not everybody, but a lot of people, drinkers or not, are quite interested, angry, upset, confused, puzzled by the beer store, because it's such a bizarre beast, as many of you know. But it's more complicated than that. It's actually amazing to me how little people actually do know about the beer store, or have known about the beer store over the years. And it's also a revelation to me, or has been, just how angry some people are. I can tell you when I look at my inbox, I almost feel like I've become the ombudsman, the beer ombudsman in this province. But it is something that people are passionate about. Whenever I write about it, I will confess, readership goes through the roof. People are not passionate about Ontario politics, but they are interested in beer. So maybe that's why you're here tonight. So I have a couple of other confessions to get out of the way before we get down to business. And one of them is that I actually worked for one of the big bad brewers many years ago when I had a gap year off at the university, and I worked at the Carling O'Keefe Brewery near the airport, now the Molson Brewery. And it was kind of a waste on me because I, as I say, barely touched the stuff, and you got free beer when you work at a brewery. So it was a travesty that the guys on the line were getting, knocking back in those days, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 beers a day, and it was, I was saving the company a bit of money. I also went out to Calgary during that gap year and worked at the Carling O'Keefe plant in Calgary, where I discovered their light beer, Alta something, I think it was 2.9. Which led me to today's beer of choice for me, which again, this is a secret, please stop the videotape. Molson 67 is my preferred beer. And craft beers don't really do it for me because they are very high alcohol content. Many of them are artisanal beers, and so they go through the roof. They're like wine, 11, 12%, not everybody knows that. So bear with me on that. The business of beer is big bucks. It's a $3 billion a year industry. There are about 6,000 people who work at the beer store, unionized workers. Another 1,000 or so who are non-unionized, 7,000 people at the beer store. I don't hate the beer store. I hate the way that what the beer store has become over the years, from brewers retail to this big strange creature which had become, over the years, consolidated because Carling O'Keefe doesn't exist anymore, taken over by Molson, merged. Labatt is now a foreign-owned entity. Molson Coors is largely controlled and based in the US. And Sleeman is owned by Sapporo, Japan. Many of you may know that, but most people in Ontario still think the beer store is a government-owned monopoly. And you can't blame them because it feels like a monopoly, like a government monopoly. It smells like a government-owned monopoly sometimes. And that's not the beer store's fault in their defense, because they do all the recycling that the LCBO probably should do on its own, but instead has been offloaded on the beer store. The beer store wanted to do that because it brings customers in the door and allows them to burnish their reputation as kind of a greenwashing, do-gooder, good corporate citizen. A lot of people, though, wonder, why do I buy my beer at the LCBO and have to schlep across town to the beer store? Well, why did government do that? Why did Dalton McGuinty suddenly surprise even his own officials by saying, we're going to make the beer store the recycler for the province, without any real impact studies or RFPs, requests for proposals? Why? Because he was lobbied by the beer store to do this, because it would, again, drive customers into their store. So let's segue from that back to the puzzle that is the beer store. Foreign-owned, privately owned, after decades of consolidation, the beer store was born as Brewers Retail back in, right after Prohibition, roughly 1929. It was Brewers Warehousing initially, and then Brewers Retail consolidated, and all the breweries in this province consolidated, and you're left really with two giants, Molson Coors and Labatt, owned in Brazil and in Colorado. So the beer store came to my attention because a guy named Tim Hudak you may remember him, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party until about a year ago, seized on this issue, two issues, the beer store and the LCBO. I think it was, and I don't say this in a critical way, ideologically driven. He wanted to privatize these government-held operations, the bad beer store and the good LCBO. I say good because the LCBO, some people hate it. A lot of people don't hate it. A lot of people are actually quite reconciled to the LCBO and have gotten accustomed to it. It depends. My wife hates it because she's a wine connoisseur and her particular brand is never in stock. But a lot of people find the LCBO pleasant. It's a nice store. No surprises, kind of Holiday Inn, other than Summerhill. It kind of looks the same everywhere, but it's not smelly and it's not unpleasant. And the staff, the unionized staff from the Ontario Public Sector Service Employees Union, because there's somebody here from OPSU tonight, so no union bashing, does a good job. They're well paid, not as extravagantly paid as you think, but they do a good job. The beer store, which is actually paid less, I believe, also unionized, UFCW, doesn't deliver that customer satisfaction. And one of my passions has been excellence in public service, excellence in customer service, and I don't see that at the beer store. I don't go there that often, but I hear it from everybody. And maybe it's because the workers are beleaguered, overwhelmed, tired of dealing with long lines of people bringing in bottles, whereas paying customers have to wait 15 minutes to get their beer because somebody else is returning hundreds of bottles and so on. The whole model just doesn't really make sense from a customer point of view. It's just not designed from the ground up. It's kind of a hodgepodge. So when you look at it, you ask yourself, well, how did it come to be? We've talked about that. Why does it still have this stranglehold on beer marketing and sales in this province? It's what we call a quasi-monopoly in the sense that it has roughly 80% of the market. The other 20% or so is the LCBO, and the craft brewers have actually a very small percentage of the market. I'm guessing you wouldn't know that it's only about 4-point-something% tops. They're hoping to go a lot better, but they're not a very good share of the market yet. Huge popular support, great employment opportunities because they actually employ a lot more workers and not as automated as the big majors. But one has to ask, how did the beer store achieve this law on Ontario? And part of it is an accident of history. Part of it, though, was perpetuated by a very intimate relationship between the beer store and its two big owners, Labatt and Molson's, and the government of the day. Doesn't matter what political stripe, conservative, progressive conservative, or liberal, there's been this intersection in terms of fundraising. In the last couple of years, hundreds of thousands of dollars went to the Liberal Party, and almost as much, or a significant chunk of that, went to the Progressive Conservative Party. And yes, the NDP also got, I think, roughly $100,000, maybe a little more, I forget now, mostly from the UFCW, but also from the big brewers. So there's fundraising, there's donations, there's enormous lobbying. They're very good. They're deemed to have among the best lobbyists in the province, partly because a lot of their lobbyists used to work for the government. Dalton McGuinty's former chief of staff works for Labatt. One of Dalton McGuinty's communications chiefs at election time works for Labatt. Molson also has close connections. So there's been an ability over the years for the government to look after the beer store, whether it's in a recycling mandate, whether it's in what they call social reference pricing, in other words, minimum pricing, or in layman's terms, no more buck a beer. Now, I'm not opposed to the idea of keeping prices at a certain threshold that discourages mass consumption, but the beer store persuaded the McGuinty government a few years ago to make that social reference pricing automatic, tiered to inflation, so that without any increases, their prices, all their prices, would rise by that increment every year. It's amazing. What other industry has quasi-monopoly and can get automatic increases mandated by government? So, I mentioned that Tim Hudak, to whom I raised a glass, first got me interested in this. I thought he was wrong on the LCBO. I thought he was right on the beer store. But he eventually lost his nerve as well. And having talked about the beer store for a couple of years leading up to the last election. He pulled back as well at the last minute and did not campaign on liberating beer, as I call it. Funny that. Table full of Labatt and Molson's people at his last fundraiser just ahead of that last election. So, lo and behold, I have to say, I wrote a lot of columns about this, was getting nowhere with any of the three parties. Andrea Horvath from the NDP says, not an issue. To this day, her party says, is critical of some of the reforms that are in the hopper and says, actually beer sales in Ontario are just fine the way they are. The UFCW encourages that, and I think the NDP is married to the idea, and I don't say this in a pejorative way, of public ownership. The problem is the beer store, remember, is not publicly owned. Tories lost interest. Liberals kind of locked onto this because they were looking at privatizing some other public assets. OPG, used to be Ontario Hydro, and Hydro One transmission lines. And they hired, or empowered, Ed Clark to run this panel about a year ago. They didn't hire him because he's doing it pro bono, in fact. He's made a bit of money over the years. TD Bank CEO, $12 million a year, $1.2 million a year pension. So, bless him, he's doing it pro bono. The nice thing about Ed Clark, though, is that this kind of conjures up third world paradigms of electing fabulously wealthy politicians because they are deemed incorruptible. They have so much money already, so many billions of dollars, perhaps ill-gotten gains, that they're less likely to steal from government. Well, Ed Clark maybe is a parallel to that. Less prone to influence, lobbying, bullying by the big brewers in the beer store. And he looked at this. I remember interviewing him last September and asking him about how he could countenance what the beer store does. And he said, okay, well, what would you do? And I said, well, look, because I knew he would ask that question. I said, Ed Clark, you used to run Canada Trust, and then you became the CEO at TD Bank, TD Canada Trust. By virtue of your focus on customer service and retail, the retail bank experience, and you used to have to line up for hours at a bank, and he figured out that you should be able to get a teller back in those days before ATMs within about a minute or two or three. And he acknowledged that customer service should be part of this equation as well. And he looked at the numbers and realized that the beer store has this enormous rent, this enormous profit, this enormous markup that they get because they have this centralized distribution system with no competition, and they charge more or less the same prices as everywhere else in the country. Ergo, they have a much higher markup, gross margin I should say, low distribution costs, roughly the same prices as everywhere else. Unlike Quebec, where distribution costs are higher, their profits in this province were probably higher than anywhere else in the industrialized world. And he said, well, let's try and get a piece of that. So his panel, as you probably know, came up with an interim report last November, which talked about getting a franchise fee from the beer store and allowing the LCBO to sell beer in higher volumes, in 12 packs. One of my obsessions over the years briefly has been that the LCBO is banned from selling 2-4s. We all know what 2-4s are because this is Canada. And that was part of a sort of secret deal. I called it, forgive me, a secret sweetheart deal, and everyone in the media loved that term, which was signed by the Progressive Conservative government roughly in 2000, mid-2000, by which the LCBO would surrender 2-4s and 12 packs to the beer store. You could only get it in the beer store. And Ed Clark said, well, maybe we should change that as well. Fast forward to this past month, his final report came out, and he changed it a little bit. Instead of saying, let's just get a franchise fee, he said, let's open it up. Let's open it up to supermarkets. Now, a lot of us will remember beer in corner stores, beer and wine in corner stores was a big deal in the 1980s under the David Peterson Liberals when they campaigned on that and then failed to implement it, didn't win the vote in the legislature. Mike Harris also campaigned on it in 1995, didn't deliver in the legislature, free vote as I recall. So Mike Harris couldn't bust the big beer store. Peterson lost interest, but this government and Ed Clark, the Liberal government, decided to go forward with it and allow supermarkets, not convenience stores, because they consider that to be too much of a political hot potato, but supermarkets to do it. Now I think that's something I've been calling for a long time. And I'll leave you on this with this thought. I've been calling for it for a long time because I think of supermarkets as being among the most efficient merchandisers on the planet. You know, razor-thin margins, they deliver a pleasant customer experience, and they're everywhere. There are thousands of supermarkets in this province, so you have much more customer accessibility. So Ed Clark has come up with this idea now where it will be about 450 supermarkets that will sell beer. A lot of people have looked at this and said, well, it's not going to happen for a couple of years, it's being phased in, it's not going to be in corner stores, it's only 450 supermarkets. I think that's a lot. This is a joke, it's a sham. We'll talk about that tonight. I'd like to hear your feedback. For what it's worth, glass half full, glass half empty, I think we're a lot further ahead than where we were a couple of years ago on this issue. On that note, I'd like to hear what you think.